Welcome to Industry Focus. Today is Tuesday, July 6th, and I'm the host of this episode, Emily Flippen. Today, I am joined by Motley Fool's senior analyst, Asit Sharma, to revisit the online dating industry and talk about two key players, of course, Match Group and Bumble. Asit, thanks for joining.
Emily, thank you for having me. And I hope we don't bumble through this podcast. And I hope we can find a match for prospective investors who are looking for a good investment in this space.
I wish I was as quick-witted as you, Asit. I have zero puns planned throughout this episode. So, you're setting the expectation high.
Zero puns are better than a lot of bad puns. So I think you're one step ahead already.
Well, we can agree to disagree there. I'm a pun enthusiast myself. But before we were getting into taping this episode, you said, I'm from a generation that didn't really use online dating. So I had to spend a lot of time getting up to speed on this industry. And I chuckled to myself because I am from a generation that used online dating, but I myself have never used any of these apps. I think I'm in the minority of millennials here who have never used, Tinder, for instance, which is owned by Match Group. So I'm in the same boat as you in a sense. I'm approaching this from a truly naive perspective.
Well, that's really cool to hear, Emily. And I should say that one of the things investing has taught me is to sort of leave my preconceptions at the door. And it has a funny way of taking you back full circle. So I could have this sort of curmudgeon-y view of online dating and say, I remember when I was dating my wife, I was writing physical letters. But how different is that than using another platform to communicate with someone? And it's funny, just in looking at an investment, it helps me become a better person, not such a grumpy person as I see technology change. I can actually sort of participate it and realize, even the printing press was major technology in its time, right?
Well, you're already less senile than I am. I know when I'm older, I'm going to be the grumpiest investor that has ever existed. And that being said, I was kind of intrigued by some of the trends that we've seen with online dating over the past year, in particular, because I can distinctly remember having conversations with coworkers that know the industry better than myself, just from being users of the products back in, I think it was probably February or March in 2020, right when the pandemic was kicking off. And there was this really interesting question mark about what would happen to the online dating industry. Would it completely die during a pandemic? Would it thrive because we had nowhere else to go? Nobody really knew. And I think that the answer was yes to both of those things, which again is completely unique. But when you think about the broad category of online dating, as you look out over the next maybe 5+ years, how are you feeling about it?
I'm feeling positive about it. You had posed a question to me when we were prepping for this podcast. You were curious as to what was going to happen right after the pandemic. So is engagement online going to fall off as people start going back to the places in real life that they meet? And that organic interaction increases. And I do think people have a hunger for that. Or will some of this remain as normal? And I think that we're going to see both things happening at the same time. I think you will see much more social interaction. People have a hunger to be back together and see each other face to face. But at the same time, we've discovered the beauty of interactions online in a way we didn't experience them before. And I think that while it's easy to see like the next 1 or 2 years as a reaction to the pandemic with some things have changed, I think what's harder to parse out is over time, are we still in the early stages of online engagement? Will there come a time, let's think outside 5 years, where people just have a hunger to dispense with scrolling through feeds and swiping and just want to be more spontaneous? Will life returned to the unpredictability of meeting someone on a chance, on a lark. And I've got some thoughts about that. We could maybe at the end of the show discuss a little bit about that.
Well, as an introvert, the idea of having to meet someone organically actually sounds like a nightmare to me. So I love the kind of arm's length relationships that you can establish via apps like Tinder and Bumble. But I think what stands out to me when I think about the industry 5 years from now and about the audience that has been curated during the pandemic, I do think it maybe will skew older. I think about all the people in my life who were maybe reluctant to adopt technology that were then forced to do so during the pandemic. Things like Zoom, right? Video chatting. I think to an extent, we've seen that with an older demographic with dating apps as well. You couldn't leave, right? You couldn't meet people organically in most places last year. So therefore, they were forced to either sit at home with their loneliness, which nobody likes, or maybe download an app and see if you can just talk to someone new. So in my mind, I think that maybe it has encouraged a slightly older audience to engage with apps that could be a real tailwind 5 years from now.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I believe you've got some insight there. I'm just personally remembering during the pandemic, my parents talking about getting on a Zoom call to meet with the group of older folks they normally meet with. They have like picnics together, they socialize, and these are people now who are 20 years older than me, 20, 30 years older than me. And I was surprised that my parents actually took the leap and were avid Zoomers. And then of course we had some Zoom calls, et cetera. But that, if you look around, that is everywhere. So now this facility with the technology, what does it mean for those who may be, let's not call them older just because of my gray hairs. Let's call them more wiser, more mature, but this age group that's beyond, let's say, that the 18-year-olds. I think in the near term, also the pandemic had this effect of making all of us reassess where we were in our lives. You see this in so many white collar jobs where folks just aren't eager to jump back into a car and commute 30 minutes each way to work. And you see it also even in entry level jobs in our society where I think about the restaurant industry, which you and I both follow. They're having such trouble filling jobs because it's such a hard industry to work in. People really want more meaningful work time, regardless of the income they're making. You can translate this into just how everyone is taking stock of their lives, regardless of their age. And I definitely see that, Emily, that older people are thinking both about what they want to do with the rest of their lives and how to get the most fruitful time out of that, but also they've got the comfort with the platforms now. So there is a potential revenue growth that we never really thought about before the pandemic for companies like Match Group and Bumble.
The last, I'll say it's a question, I guess, conversation piece I want to pose to us before moving on to talk about some of these businesses is about the penetration in the online dating community. One of the numbers that Match Group broke out was that 50% of North Americans at one point have tried online dating. And I found myself going back and forth on this number a lot. It was kind of the question of, is this a glass half full or a glass half empty? Because in my mind, 50%, at least it immediately struck me as a very large number of people. And I know that online dating is the most popular way for people to meet their partners in today's day and age, but 50% struck me as really saturated. Now, the management team at Match Group talked about it like an opportunity, which just took me by surprise. And I found myself going back and forth. Maybe it has to do with maybe the number of apps that 50% are engaging with. It's more than just one. It's typically in the range of 3 to 4. So maybe just monetizing that 50% is better. But I can't imagine you get more saturated than 50% when it comes to online dating, right?
Yeah, and I'm slowly understanding about this business model that it favors companies which have multiple apps because no one is satisfied with just one app. You try an app, and if the experience isn't good, then you can confide in a friend. And what is that friend going to tell you, Emily? Well, look, download this other app because this is actually more appropriate for you. So it takes 3 to 4 before you hit on one that you have some success with. So I like that about the model. As for using that to get past the 50%, I don't know, maybe it's going to be hard. Now, of course, yeah, management is going to sell it to them. That's all 50% white space. And Match CFO Gary Swidler recently discussed this at an investors conference and said, he said, look, there's no reason why dating apps can't be like Uber or Lyft. Nearly everyone has tried to use some type of car service. And that struck me as odd right off the bat, because I don't think they're at 100% penetration between Uber and Lyft. But maybe he was including the realm of people who have flagged a taxi down with two fingers. Maybe he was including that group in there. But basically his point was it comes down to safety and comfort with the approach. So of that 50% that still hasn't tried a dating app, they're worried about the vulnerability, of putting themselves out there. There's some kind of personal safety, especially I think if you are an introvert, which Emily, you always say that, but you don't strike me as much of an introvert. But we'll save that for another podcast. But there is some barrier that you have to overcome in that sense. And he also said just the idea, the approach of these apps, which are mostly one-to-one, right? It's one person trying to hit another person on both sides. They're not group apps. One of the solutions that Swidler talked about was increasing investment in a space called social discovery, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But picture apps which are aimed at groups and not necessarily for dating. Now, this sounds like a lot of other social media and platforms that we've been looking at for years, but there are some differences which we'll talk about. So in their opinion, in management's opinion, that is all opportunity. With you, Emily, I remain a little skeptical. I think, yeah, maybe they get to 52, 55%, 60%, and then it's about monetizing what they've already got, the people who are the avid users.
And bringing that internationally, of course, which is a good kind of segue to Match Group, obviously quoting their CFO there prior. And when I was prepping for today's episode, thinking about comparing Match Group and Bumble, in my mind, I thought to myself, well, this is going to be a really quantitative discussion, right? It's all about active users. It's all about how well they monetize their users. And I found myself going down this very qualitative rabbit hole, in particular, looking at this future of dating report that Match Group had issued back in, I believe it was March of this year. It somehow went straight under my radar, but it has some really interesting stats regarding Tinder in particular, which is its most popular dating platform, and how it performed during the pandemic. So I apologize for everybody who was asking for more quantitative data here for these businesses. We'll get to it. But first, I really do want to sift through some of your thoughts about this report here, because it was interesting. And before we get into it, for people who aren't familiar with Tinder, it is their most popular app, but it's also aimed at mainly Gen Z customers. So these are 18 to 25-year-olds. It has a younger audience. So don't extrapolate these numbers to be all of Match's platforms like OkCupid, Plenty of Fish, obviously Match, namesake, dating platforms. This is just Tinder specific. What did you think about this report?
Some of it was really great and informative in terms of looking at the future of platforms, the near future of platforms. I also thought that the report was something of a story we've heard before. So the title is "The Future of Dating is Fluid." And I thought to myself, well, the past of dating is also fluid. Right now on the side, I'm reading a book called All Creatures Great and Small. And for those of you who watch a lot of series, this was a Netflix series. It's based on a veterinarian from the 20th century, James Herriot, and it describes his experiences as a small town veterinarian in the English countryside in the 1930s through the 1950s. Part of the book, he's always examining animals, and then part of the book he's talking about this woman he has a crush on, who's this really like smart and attractive young farmer's daughter, who's also sophisticated, and his courting of her, simultaneously he lives with the person who owns a veterinary practice, and with the owner's younger brother, Tristan. He often goes out to bars and pubs and has experiences. They date nurses, and it's all very comical and fun. But it doesn't look a lot different than online dating today, because if you are in a totally virtual environment, you still have those crazy experiences, right? You you see someone's profile who looks really interesting, and then you realize that, wow, that was a very weird person. At least these are the stories that I hear from people who use these apps a lot. So when you break down the conclusions they came up with, some of these are pandemic influenced, but some of them I think are just the reflect the cyclical nature of human relationships. So let's go to one of the big observations that we'll see less predictable courtship. There'll be more fluidity in terms of expectations, more honesty about emotions, and more focus on experiences. That one to me, Emily, is interesting because I think it reflects what's happened over the past year. I think we've all learned to become a little bit more honest about what we're going through because we've had this sort of mass therapy session in trying to get through COVID. I know I am, and I will say a quick pitch here for those of you who are Motley Fool subscribers and can view live. We have a session every Wednesday, the Mindset Session with Tim Byers and Brian Stoffel. I will say our colleague Tim Byers is unflinchingly honest about his emotional makeup. And I think over the last year, I've learned to be a little bit more open about what I'm going through. But this is not just one episode of Motley Fool Live. I think it's our society as a whole. We're having more conversations about mental health, about where we are. So this struck me as something sort of predictable. Also, that some stats from the report, 60% of you Tinder users over the last year came on because they felt lonely. 43% of the users said the app made them feel less lonely. And they've got some other statistics as well that are pandemic related about conversations being longer, more messages being sent, things that you would expect. Now, to me, one of the big takeaways is that 50% of Tinder users had a video chat with a match during the pandemic, and 40% plan to continue to do that even post-pandemic. I think these video conversations are here to stay, Emily. And I think regardless what happens in real life, even if we go back to mostly the way we were with commuting into work, having in-person meetings, I think there's something that's happened in our society, which is that we are all much more receptive now. If we can't make it in person, it's no big deal to video chat. I see this as a plus for these platforms. I see it as a plus for Tinder. What are your thoughts before we talk about the big predictions in the report? What are your thoughts about this report?
Well, the video chatting gave me a little bit of a chuckle, honestly, a little bit of a pause. So my boyfriend and I started dating when I was in college, and I went to college in China and he was not in China. And so we did a decent amount of video chatting, right, in the early stages of our relationship. And I remember the anxiety that was headed into our first video chat. I literally made a notebook of topics to talk about, so there were no awkward silences. And I remember being so nervous about that conversation. So the idea of jumping on a social media platform and literally video chatting with a complete stranger, to me, is so strange. And seeing what a large percentage of people were willing to do that, presumably because so many people flocked to the platform from loneliness, really struck me by surprise. But what also struck me by surprise, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but one of Tinder's 8 predictions for the next decade of dating was that people will always want to date someone close by. And it was this mix between people love video chatting, presumably, right? Digital dates will remain part of the new normal. I think that was their 4th prediction, while also matching that with the desire to date somebody who is physically close to you. In my mind, I guess those two things are always kind of counterintuitive, right? Why video chat with somebody if you could see them in person? But I do think that there is more fluidity, I guess, with how we perceive dating, or I should say, how Tinder app users perceive dating.
Well, that is a lot to unpack there, Emily. But I will say that I give you a lot of points for being so prepared for that first video date.
I didn't need the notes, by the way. It was a pointless exercise.
After like a minute or two, like anything else, right? You went with the flow. But this is reflective of something else we'll talk about later. I think in the Bumble section of this podcast, what happens when you have a lot of risk in a conversation, or maybe you feel that it might not go well. But not to give too much away, I find that very amusing, but also in a very, I think, charming way. And I see that there's something in that we can all relate to. I will say that one of their predictions stuck out to me. More people want to see where things go. I'm confused by that one. So this prediction, isn't that what online dating is supposed to facilitate, right? Let's see where things go. Because, in real life, you're taking all the risk. You're meeting at a cafe. You're spending time. It's, you can leave the date all of a sudden. We've all seen that on sitcoms, right? You find a clever way, or you have a friend who calls you because you've sent them a signal under the table via text to get you out of the date. I thought online dating was about the ability to take some risk out and to see where things went. But maybe within that context, people are willing to spend more time. And this is only good for platforms which are trying to monetize users. So that has an extension in average revenue per user, let's say for Match Group, because what it means is that after a while, you're going to have to go from Tinder, the freemium version, which is the version you start out with, to one of their levels. I think there's gold, and the other one I think is plus, correct? Platinum, sorry. Yeah, so you're going to want to upgrade, and that's good if there's more uncertainty in our society, and the pandemic has made people more willing to take more time. So I thought that was interesting. Here's another one that I again, this may be an age thing. Unpack this one for me. Small touches will have a big impact. There was a 23% increase in cuddle needs on Tinder. Can you unpack what that means? And also, what do you think about that? Small touches will have a big impact.
This was by far, out of the 8 predictions that Tinder had for the next decade, the one that left me scratching my head the most, because they seem to extrapolate this point based off the usage of the word cuddle in bios. And presumably that was in part probably a lot of loneliness that people were experiencing, especially single people who lived by themselves or with a roommate, right? And they just wanted that little cuddle, right? The connection that they hadn't had. I'm not sure this stays post-pandemic, if I'm honest with you. I'm not sure if I extrapolate the need for cuddles out for the next decade at a higher rate than the cuddle needs were for in 2019. But to your point, I'm not sure it matters for Tinder or for Match Group, because a lot of these predictions, including more transparency, more authenticity, more focus on activities, all of these things are pointing towards Tinder being less of a platform where you meet your spouse and more of a platform where you meet lots of different people who have different needs and desires. And maybe you do meet your spouse, right? Maybe your spouse is one of those people, but maybe you meet people you just date for a couple weeks. Maybe you meet friends, maybe you meet groups. And I think that a lot of that focus has been maybe shifted away from the spouse and the very clear courtship that you expect when meeting somebody on Tinder. And some people expect when meeting somebody on Tinder, and more towards a fluid option to do whatever you want. But you're right, the cuddle thing did leave me scratching my head.
Yeah, I think that's a really good explanation. And again, apologies to those who are looking for something more quantitative out of this, but actually, this is very important to the conversation about the platform, because I think this idea of an increase in the mention of cuddles, the need for cuddles, is expressing a human emotion, which is really relevant to the performance of the platform, and also its relevance to society. So we're getting more comfortable as a group expressing our need to be close to other people. Again, that doesn't mean that you want to cuddle with a partner. I think what I take out of that is there's an increase in people wanting to be connected. And the easy thing for someone my age is to say, well, that means that it's not great for the platform. People want to get together in real life and feel the warmth of a human touch. But I think really what we can extrapolate out of this is that the platform provides that virtual cuddle just by expressing that thought and having someone reciprocate that maybe in their profile. You see someone else's profile who also mentions the need for a cuddle. There's some connection there. So I will be looking at this if they happen to put out a report next year to see what happened with those mentions. If they do, and if I happen to remember it, it'll be of interest to me.
Well, for the sake of adding something quantitative to this discussion before we move on for the conversation around Bumble, which is a really interesting conversation, maybe let's do a little comparison of pandemic and recent performance for Match Group. Some of the numbers that I pulled from the pandemic, just for a brief overview, is they saw a huge increase in usage from the app itself. So there's a 42% increase in matches, an 11% increase in swipes, all during the pandemic. And that led to decent revenue growth, 12% year over year, but their average revenue per user really struggled because a lot of these little add-ons, right? These a la carte purchases, super likes on the Tinder platform, they just immediately lost value when you weren't actually meeting up with the person. So they weren't able to monetize the platform as well, despite it being more popular. And what I really like to see in their most recent quarters, that they've retained a lot of the popularity while also increasing the monetization of their platform. And they still had amazing, I think it was 23% revenue growth in the most recent quarter, 12% subscriber growth. But more importantly, that average revenue per subscriber was up nearly 10%. I think it was 64 cents on average per subscriber, which did rise across every single brand in Match Group's collection of dating apps. So to me, I looking at these numbers, I got really excited about this business all over again.
Yeah, I mean, that revenue growth, interesting, 18% of it from Tinder and 30% of it from non-Tinder platforms. So you mentioned Hinge, OkCupid, Chispa, BLK in our notes. Match Group is really a portfolio business. So we tend to equate Tinder with Match Group just because it's the biggest revenue driver. But I wanted to point out or call out Hinge here because that is a really fast-growing app with millennial and younger generations. And so far, it's a North American app, although they've got some exposure in the UK. So when we look at international expansion, that is a candidate for future growth. They've got apps like Pairs, which is pretty well known in Taiwan, South Korea. They have one called Plenty of Fish, which I'd never heard of, Emily. So
you haven't seen the ads for Plenty of Fish?
No, and I don't know like what I'm watching that I don't see ads for Plenty of Fish. I tend to watch some obscure things. Maybe that's it. But do you happen to know what this is, or can you tell from the commercials? What is it?
I think, and I'm solely basing this off of the TV commercials I think I saw when I was in middle school or high school. I think it's a dating site aimed at older users. Apologies to anybody who uses it if I've horribly incorrectly misrepresented that platform, but I believe that's what Plenty of Fish is.
Okay, well, we give you the picture though, right? This is a company that has multiple apps because, as we said before, that's how you win in this game, is by being a portfolio company and getting a user, having them have 3 or 4 other apps which are within your own brand portfolio, and then monetizing that. And I must say, Emily, I hadn't looked at these financials in a while. I was really impressed just looking at the financial statements. The company had operating income in the most recent quarter of $189 million. That's on $667 million in revenue in one quarter. So a solidly profitable company with pretty decent cash flows. They do have a fair amount of debt on the balance sheet. I think you'll probably know this better than me. I'm guessing that was came with the spinoff last year. So they took some debt with them as a public company now, but not too difficult a debt burden. Let's see, it's about $3.8 billion of debt on the books versus current assets of $1.2 billion. So while that doesn't look great in terms of the ability to pay something like that off very quickly, cash flows are solid. So I can definitely see some refinancings in the future, paying down those senior notes. The debt here isn't that much of an issue. Now, for me, I'm looking at these financials and thinking about market share, because I have always tended to think of Match as a one-to-one company. So it's providing apps that are connecting singles, and that's how it's going to grow. But increasingly, that's not where the company is headed, at least in terms of making their total addressable market bigger. That actually is going to come from things like this Hyperconnect acquisition that the company made earlier this year that we briefly mentioned or alluded to above. So Hyperconnect is a South Korean company. Match acquired them for about $1.7 billion earlier this year. And it specializes in something called social discovery. So social discovery, we have to get to the bottom of this. This may sound like just another social platform, for example, Facebook or Twitter. But social discovery is about connecting disparate people. And Hyperconnect's big calling card is its ability to connect people in real time across languages. So you can communicate in real time with someone in South Korea, and you can be speaking English, they can be speaking South Korean, and it will help you have this real-time interaction. The company has two apps, Azar and Hakuna Live. So Azar lets you have one-to-one interaction, and Hakuna Live is sort of like a live video broadcast platform. The big thing here is that these platforms really aren't dating platforms. They're just more about connecting people together. So some thoughts on this, Emily, because part of this balance sheet that's grown so big is this acquisition, which was the biggest in Match Group's history. So you're looking at the future. It's not all about one-to-one connecting singles.
I love these acquisitions. I will admit that I think they're bold bets. This is a company that has been solely focused on that one-to-one experience. So expanding into things like live video broadcasting can scare off lots of people. And I do think it makes me a bit nervous. But I also think we have to recognize that dating and connections look differently depending on where you are in the world and understanding your background and culture. So I like the boldness of the move. And I like the idea that Match Group is not going to be this, in particular, North American dating powerhouse, but rather a platform of platforms that are focused on connecting people across the globe. I like that idea. I will say becoming increasingly international does have its own risks. And in the most recent quarter, they did call out the really low vaccination rates in Japan as a potential risk for them, right? That means lower monetization potential. And Japan's a big market for them, with pairs in particular. So as we look at this increasingly international business, it's harder to just look at the trends that we see here in the United States or North America broadly and say, okay, well, this works here, so we're going to port it over to Japan or South Korea or Taiwan. And in reality, I think it needs to be acquired because it's so unique.
Yeah, I totally see the caution around there. But I want to also just let's imagine something as well. I think there's the need for a super app in South Korea, in Japan, in China. These are three really big industrialized companies with youth populations which are in decline versus previous years, declining birth rates. Not so much India, Vietnam, and some other countries in Asia, but at least these three big ones. There is a place for an app to connect disenchanted youth who have been locked out of the real estate market because it's so expensive to buy your own home, who have rebelled against getting married early as the cultures promote. And now we're on sort of the back side of that demographic equation. It's an economic problem that all three countries face. I think South Korea most severely, but China's not far behind with all the missteps they had with their one-child policy over the past few decades. And Japan, increasingly, the youth are, again, not getting married at the rates they used to. So not that you need marriage in a society. We could debate that all day long, but I do think there is a place for disenchanted youth to connect that's still to be created in a virtual space or metaverse type space. And it strikes me that Match Group, with its big balance sheet, its inclination to acquire good apps and put their own sort of integrated platforms behind them, I think there's some room here in the future for them to concentrate on Asia as a really not a booming market in the way we tend to think of Asia, but a market where there are some hidden revenue streams. But this is just a thought for management. If you're listening, give it a shot. It's just a fraction of your R&D budget.
I love that. And as we run out of time here, let's not forget to talk about probably the newest, biggest competitor to Match Group, at least in the United States, that recently went public, and that's Bumble. I am kicking myself because I can't remember off the top of my head, Austin, if we talked about Bumble on Industry Focus before. I will say it's not one that I'm not as it's one that I'm not as excited about as Match Group for a collection of reasons. I think maybe that's why I've been hesitant to cover it, but it's a women first dating app. So it's you can think about it in the same vein as Tinder, but women have to make the first move. So theoretically, it's more attractive for a male audience, right? Because you're the one who is kind of catalyzing or getting a conversation catalyzed to yourself. And it's female first in the sense that, well, it empowers women to make the first move and to maybe feel safe and comfortable in starting those conversations. I think in practice, it ends up being a little strange, just based off conversations I've had with people who use it. But I'm curious what your thoughts are about Bumble in this space.
I think Bumble is an idea that's still in its early stages. They are, I mean, ostensibly from the numbers, doing pretty well. They saw a 43% increase in year-over-year revenue. The app itself grew 61%. So there's definitely uptake of the idea. But the question is, over time, is Bumble's unique selling proposition all that much more powerful than any one of the Match Group apps? I think there is something that is comforting. Let's say that your issue is safety, as earlier we mentioned, the CFO of Match Group pointing out a stumbling block for such apps. Then I think Bumble is attractive. And I'm not sure which it's more attractive to. I can see both sides. As you mentioned, I think it does put the ball in men's court, and that's great. So there is, I think, for some men, a real attraction to that here's where, you can start the conversation and you get to present yourself in a bit more of a holistic way than, say, one of Match Group's apps. And I think, but, from the other side, this will appeal and does appeal to women who want to feel empowered. The question, though, and this is an age-old question, becomes, well, what is women's empowerment? Maybe it's just the ability to use any app that you select, and what is a safe conversation anyway? We'll talk about that in just a minute. But I'm not as familiar with Bumble. We haven't talked about it on Industry Focus, and I think part of the reason is that maybe the growth rates have to be a little in excess of what they are to catch our eye. Now, I know that sounds crazy, right? They're growing at a 43% clip year over year. What more do you want? But I think as a number two challenger, you have to have something extremely persuasive. And I can think of so many companies in the tech industry that are small challengers, but have growth rates that are so much in excess of the leaders that you can't help but look at them. And I think the fact that we haven't discussed Bumble, or it's not top of mind for you, Emily, and I know you have thought a lot about Match Group, says something as well, that it's a stock that you want to keep your eye on, but there's something inherently dubious about the business model for the long term. At least that seems to be the expression of a lot of investors that I've just chatted with really briefly since Bumble. I mean, since it was growing as a private company, it's just a recent IPO. But you also mentioned, Emily, when we were prepping for this episode, that you had some concerns outside of the business proposition about the company.
It's funny. I have concerns. They have substantial debt. They're not profitable. They also only break down average revenue per paying user as opposed to Match Group, which does average revenue per user. And I think that doesn't give quite a clear picture about their monetization potential. All of that being said, I love how you framed up the conversation around Bumble, Osset, by saying, is it something that you have to look at? And I've never had the conversation because despite following and investing in Match Group, I've never felt threatened by Bumble, right? I've never thought, oh, I have to look at Bumble until last week when I saw this article float by my desk that said they're testing this thing called a safe space dating spot, like a physical location where people and app users can meet up. And it got me thinking. I was like, is this the thing that sets Bumble apart from Tinder or Hinge? Is this the thing that gets catalyzes engagement and monetization? It certainly made me turn my head.
Right. Very interesting. So you sent me this article this was in Bloomberg on July 24th. They're going to open a cafe and wine bar for daters, networkers, and friends. It's been in the works for a while. It's going to be called Bumble Brew. This will be opened, I believe, in New York City. I think that it's an interesting idea as an extension of the business model, but it brings up the same questions. Just what is a safe cafe, or a cafe that's dedicated for daters and networkers? It reminds me of those startups in Silicon Valley from a few years ago that recreated the municipal bus, right? An app. What this company is going to do is, we figured out that if you take a large vehicle and you have it at a certain predictable route and people pay when they get on, that you can make a ton of money doing this. And we want to raise hundreds of millions of dollars in capital for this idea. Congratulations, you just created the bus route. There were several companies like that. And this is sort of those weird ideas that doesn't sound like it's going to translate well IRL in real life, because that's exactly what restaurants and cafes are for. They are for people who are dating, for people who are networking, and for people who are friends. That's where you go to meet, and you call the shots when you decide to meet at a restaurant with a date. If it's a first date, yeah, you might pick a space that to you is a safe space. It's a place you're a regular at, or it's got an easy exit if you want that friend to text you or call you when you're having a really bad date. There are ways you can set up a safe space on your own terms. I'm not sure that we need a dedicated restaurant for people to feel that safety. However, I do get that in the society we live in today, we need spaces that people feel safe in. And whether this is to have conversations about politics or religion, or perhaps in the dating sphere, we always need spaces where we feel we can meet with fellow people and at least have our substantial relationships and arguments. That's just part of today's society. It's a more risk-averse society from when I was younger, but some parts of it I like, in that it's striving to be. Our society is, I know this may not sound like it to those of you who watch the news, but our society is striving to be more inclusive on several fronts. So I totally get the sentiment behind this. I don't think it really is going to make much of a dent, in their financials. I don't think it's meant to be. What it will do for Bumble's brand, I don't know. Maybe it makes them more visible in a place like New York City, where you've got part of your addressable market and it's such a dense place. But what are your thoughts about this, Emily? Does this sort of lessen your confusion around the concept, or make you more interested in buying it? Does it clarify anything for you?
It confused me even more, because we talk about these apps in a digital world and how dating is going digital, and this big investment in physical space. And I think there's, of course, physical space when it comes to dating. It's impossible to not have it. But I think in order for this to mean something financially for Bumble, it would require a huge amount of investments across at least the United States, potentially across the globe, in a way that I don't think is actually going to be meaningful for them. But I will say, I got a chuckle myself just imagining, if I was single living in New York City, plopping myself down on a Saturday morning in the Bumble Cafe, and then organizing my 30-minute dates, one right after the other, and thinking to myself, well, wouldn't that be wonderfully convenient? But I'm not sure if anyone wants to approach dating like a business meeting. So I will see if this is successful. I certainly think it's good for their brand, right? Having big spaces, having that big sign, that awareness in a really visible area, I think certainly does something to keep Bumble part of the conversation. But I agree also with your takeaway that probably doesn't change much.
Well, if there's one place where it works, if you are going to run your romantic life as a business, I guess New York would be the place, right? So I think they got the location right.
It's a problem that I've never had in my life, right? Having too many dates, but somebody out there, I will imagine, will use the Bumble Cafe for exactly that.
Certainly.
Well, Asit, I'd continue to have this conversation, but I think my next date has arrived. So I'm gonna shuffle you out of that cafe and express the next guest in. No, I'm joking. But
No,
thank you for joining.
yes, sounds great, Emily. I leave having learned a lot. I will take notes as I prepare for my next date so I can do better next time. But this was a blast as always.
It's always fun. And Fools, thanks for playing along with us for this episode. It was a fun kind of conversation to have. I love when we have these qualitative discussions. And yeah, that does it for this episode of Industry Focus. If you have any questions or just want to reach out, don't be afraid to email us as always at industryfocus@fool.com. But as always, people on the program may own companies discussed on the show, and the Motley Fool may have formal recommendations for or against any stocks mentioned, so don't buy or sell anything based solely on what we say. Thanks to Tim Sparks for his work behind the screen today. For Asit Sharma, I'm Emily Flippen. Thanks for listening and Fool On.